Robs. We are back with Herzl. Herzl, as I remember him. Herzl, of course, being the founder of Zionism. According to the writer of this biography, Erwin Rosenberger, who worked with Herzl on Die Welt and forming the intellectual basis for the founding of Israel. He claims that Herzl's objective was to overtake Palestine, which a lot of people say isn't even a place, but obviously it was. And I mean, you got to blame most of the problems on the United Nations. I mean, I think it was probably wrong that the United Nations, I don't know the exact details, I'll be honest. I don't know the exact details of Israel becoming a state and how they obtained the land. I never really looked into it. But, I mean, Israel's been there now, 75 years? So, I mean, it's there and it's not going away. So they do have a right to defend themselves. And some people disagree with that and they claim that they're overreaching that aim. But, I mean, you have a right to defend yourself. And if people are attacking you, then you vanquish them. That's my opinion on the whole matter. Again, I don't know the exact origins of how Israel came about. I'm sure it wasn't fair or however, but that being said, that's how almost every country in the world was founded. So you can't really, I mean, you could litigate it. I don't know. It's not really my problem. My whole theory is that once you become a state, you have the right to defend yourself to any lengths. As long as you're not openly, you have any lengths. Anybody, it's not like Hamas is not engaging with Israel because they do. So there you go. 17. One Sunday morning, I was drowsing on my sofa, wondering whether or not to go out, when there was a knock at the door, probably one of my friends. Half sitting up, I called out, "Come in." The moment I saw who my visitor was, I jumped from my sofa in delighted surprise. It was Herzl. I greeted him respectfully and asked him to be seated, wondering what urgent business might have brought him to my room. What do you got, bruv? Does that say show me feet? Jesus Christ. There's still feet people out here? I greeted him respectfully and asked him to be seated, wondering what urgent business might have brought him to my room, but he merely asked casually, as though he had been one of my student comrades, "Rosenberger, would you like to stroll about with me for a while?" I said I would, be only too happy to, and in a moment we were off. In the early period of his Zionist activity, Herzl did not husband his time as jealously as in later days. He was not yet troubled by the thought that a man's life was a fleeting thing, and that each hour, indeed each second, must be utilized for the cause as something precious that would never return. He was anything but a carefree time waster when I came to know him in the spring of 1897, but he was not yet a slave of the clock. He was willing to take a few hours off when, as on that Sunday morning, he felt a need for relaxation. We walked at a leisurely pace, chatting casually about the Zionist movement, as well as other matters. Nothing of an official nature came up. It was simply a pleasant stroll. Once Herzl pointed to a passing streetcar with its conductor standing outside on a small platform. "Has it ever occurred to you," he asked, "that a streetcar conductor spends half his life on a little stand that scarcely has room for his feet?" He was in a good humor. Like a true reporter, he took notice of everything happening about him and automatically provided some commentary. Strolling aimlessly, we came to the university. An elderly beggar was standing nearby. Herzl gave him a coin. Then, after walking on a short distance, he stopped and, taking his watch from out of his vest pocket, said, "Let's wait a minute and make a check on how many passers-by pay him any attention." The street was fairly deserted, so that during our brief check period, the old man enjoyed very few of the blessings of the golden Vienna heart. Shaking his head slightly, Herzl put his watch back in his pocket. "In the Jewish state," he remarked, "there will be no beggars standing in front of our university." As we passed the arcade cafe on the Universital Strasse, I observed in a low voice, "Fritz Austerlitz is sitting over there." Herzl glanced at the seats in the colonnade. Austerlitz had surely recognized him, but no greeting was exchanged. Friedrich, I'll read that over again since the stream stopped. Friedrich Austerlitz, a first-rate journalist, was together with Victor Adler the decisive influence on the Viennese social democratic paper Arbeiter Zeitung. Both had abandoned Judaism, and they dismissed the scheme for founding a Jewish state as an aberration of over-imaginative utopian minds. Their anti-Zionism also had a practical side. At that time, there was as yet no well-developed social democratic Jewish workers' movement, and the Arbeiter Zeitung had reason to fear that a Jew who embraced Zionism was lost to the Social Democratic Party. In Vienna and throughout Austria, there were numerous Jewish workers and commercial employees. The Jewish proletariat in Galicia numbered many thousands and was sunk in poverty. What's up, bruv? Needless to say, the Social Democrats wished these multitudes to put their faith in Karl Marx rather than Theodor Herzl. Right. Another source of conflict was the fact that the Social Democratic movement was internationalist, while the Zionist movement was Jewish nationalist. The gulf seemed unbridgeable, and the two groups remained vigorously opposed to each other. Austerlitz writes a great many of the Arbeiter Zeitung's editorials, I remarked. Herzl did not reply. I had a suspicion that he had read very little of Austerlitz's work, perhaps none of it. He was sublimely ignorant of everything in the way of Viennese journalism that did not emanate from the new Free Press's offices at number 11 Fichtegasse. His viewpoint was very simple. Whatever was worth knowing appeared in the press, and what did not appear in the press was not worth knowing, or at least not essential. Hence, it was a waste of energy to scrutinize all the lesser Viennese papers day after day. As we walked along, noting various people and places, I could not help wondering whether Herzl planned to turn our Sunday morning stroll into a feuilleton. If so, he offered no hint of his intention. Indeed, he made it a practice never to advertise his literary projects in advance. In this, he differed from other writers of my acquaintance, who loudly announced their forthcoming productions and then, often as not, failed to produce. A short distance beyond Trinity Church we encountered two pretty girls of about 17 or 18. As we passed, one of them said rather loudly with youthful unconstraint, "That's Herzl." The subject of her remark did not so much as change expression. Then, after we had gone a few more steps, he said matter-of-factly, "If I were still young, I'd turn around and go after them. He was then 37, no longer young. How Herzl had been when he was half that young or old, I did not, of course, know. At the time I knew him, however, he was anything but the type of man who loses his head at the sight of a petticoat and is ready to rush into a romantic adventure. His attractive appearance and many winning qualities would have made feminine conquests an easy matter, but quite apart from the fact that he was a married man and a father, not necessarily an ironclad guarantee of virtue, the leader of the Zionist movement directed his thoughts and efforts to other goals. At another point in our walk, Herzl remarked, I'm omitting everything in Kirchner except the Jewish state and the Palais Bourbon, or is it Bourbon? Kirchner referred to Kirchner's Calendera of German literature, a who's who of German language, authors, poets, journalists, and editors from the most celebrated to the most obscure, which provided biographical information and a list of published works, if any. The Palais Bourbon was a collection of brilliant essays from Herzl's Paris days. It was interesting that he considered the Bourbon and the Jewish state the only two of his works which were worth listing after his name. At noon, the two Sunday strollers bent their steps, at Herzl's suggestion, to a restaurant in the Josefstadt district of Vienna. 18. On June 24th, Herzl began his summer vacation. I had assumed he would go directly to Reichenau and was therefore surprised when he told me he would first visit his family in Ischl. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. I knew that the situation at the new Free Press had reached a critical point. Would he at least be forced to yield to his employer's pressure and, with a heavy heart, abandon his beloved Welt? It seemed obvious that he was now going to Ischl to discuss just this problem with his father, whose experience, wisdom, and practical good sense he highly respected. At this point, I was greatly encouraged by receiving a postcard which Herzl had sent just before his departure for Ischl. It read, Dear Rosenberger, please don't forget to send me at Ischl as soon as possible the Father Ignatius article, which Heckler dictated to you in translation. Best regards, Herzl. 6/24/97, Railroad Station, Vienna. This hardly seemed like the sort of card Herzl would have written if he had been preparing to bid Die Welt farewell. Even at the railroad station, where he must have had many other things to occupy his mind, his thoughts had been dominated by the magazine. The Father Ignatius to whom Herzl referred was an English monk who lived in St. Anthony's Abbey in Wales. His article for Die Welt was suffused with love for the Jewish people and for Zion. In it, he said, the Jews must once again have a definite home on earth, a country, a constitution, an assured center to which those of them that are homeless and cast out can direct their steps, where they can lay their heads to rest in honor. And further, the Jews have already made divine truth known to all the peoples of the earth. The name Zion has become a blessing and an inspiration for untold myriads. In St. Paul's Cathedral in London, in St. Peter's Church in Rome, in St. Peter's Cathedral in Vienna, in St. Isaac's Church in Moscow, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, it is impossible to hold a divine service into whose ritual the literature of Jerusalem, the songs of Zion have not been woven. The Jews are God's chosen instrument. They have, as their prophets foretold, performed many wonders among the peoples of the earth, and in the future they shall also carry out the other prophecies. At the bottom of the article, Father Ignatius wrote, In love for Zion, I sign Ignatius. While Herzl, I assume that means, was absent from Vienna, I endlessly asked myself the same question. What will his decision be? I tried not to think of what it would mean if the worst came to pass, and he broke away from the Zionist movement. And then one day, perhaps 5 days after his departure, I was sitting at my desk at number 11 Rembrandtstrasse, buried in manuscripts and galley proofs, when the door opened and I looked in to see him again. We discussed matters pertaining to the magazine, and I showed him the latest mail and other papers. From his undiminished interest, to me, it seemed, if anything, heightened. I readily concluded which way the die had been cast. He looked better than when I had last seen him and was in good spirits. The country air, the change of scenery, and the visit with his family had obviously been beneficial. Herzl explained that he was stopping in Vienna only briefly before leaving for Reichenau to continue preparations for the Congress. He had made his decision. He would remain faithful to the Jewish state and Die Welt. As far as the new free press was concerned, he would simply take his chances. I would like you to come out to Reichenau on Sunday, he said. There will be work to do for Die Welt. He gave me the train schedule and said he would be staying at the Hotel Thaloff. Then he dictated a number of letters, most of them pertaining to the Congress. Sunday morning, I took the train to Reichenau. When I entered Herzl's hotel room, he was seated at a table by the open window, pen in hand. On the table were a bottle of ink and various papers. The window looked out on a small garden. Quid novi ex vindo bona? I replied that there was nothing much new in Vienna. How did Reichenau and the surrounding region strike me? Delightful. Then, looking out at the garden, I remarked, it must be. Pleasant working here? Herzl completed the sentence, and he shook his head and said, the work is not going very well. He did not look as well as he had in Vienna a few days before. As I was unpacking the papers I had brought with me, he said, no, first stroll around a bit. Be back by noon, and save your appetite. You're going to have a good meal. I didn't wander far from the hotel. Under other circumstances, I would have taken more interest in the mountains, trees, and meadows all around, but at that moment, I was thinking chiefly of the man inside at the writing table. It distressed me to see him looking poorly. It was obviously overexertion. He was taking too much of a burden upon himself. After a short while, I returned to the hotel and told Herzl that I had had my fill of walking. Good, he said. Then let's begin. He dictated several letters, and while I transcribed them for his signature, he looked through the material for Die Welt, which I had brought along. It occurred to me that the room might not be the most favorable for working, for the voices of a woman and two children, hotel guests, came through the open window from the garden outside. After lunch, we discussed the articles and shorter items that were to appear in the next issue. Then Herzl dictated a few more letters to prospective Congress delegates. In the room, there was a full-length mirror, and as Herzl paced the floor, giving dictation, his glance occasionally fell upon his image in the glass. He had every reason to take pleasure in what he saw, and yet one might have supposed from his behavior that he was looking at the likeness of a stranger. I never saw the slightest indication that Herzl was vain about his appearance. He must have known that he was a handsome man, but he never gave an outward sign of that knowledge. Late in the afternoon, as the time approached for my departure, I gathered together the manuscripts which we had made ready for the printer. Herzl accompanied me to the station. As we walked slowly through the countryside, which united all the varied charms of mountain and valley, he held forth on the features of the landscape, the Racks, the Schneeberg, the Schwarzach Valley, the Rocks Plateau. He told me about the owners of the Hotel Thaloff and mentioned in passing that the hotel was some 500 meters above sea level. He didn't lecture or declaim. He merely reported in his normal conversational tone. If I had taken it all down in my notebook, The result would have been a delightful Herzl feuilleton. We'll get to almost page 100 today. 19. Typographical errors are one of the occupational hazards of the journalistic profession. The blame for a typo falls on three persons: the typesetter who made the original error, the proofreader at the print shop, and the editor, whose job it is to see that the galleys are read. If the editor naively assumes that the printer's proofreader is infallible, the typo gremlin is apt to have a field day. On July 9th, 5 days after my trip to Reichenau, I received the following letter: Falloff, July 8th, 1897. Dear Rosenberger, there is a most unpleasant typographical error in the week. Angiospat, spat at, instead of angiocht, jeered at. It reminds me of the lies that appear in certain papers whose tone I despise, and it may result in an official correction. I have agreed to Knopf's proposal to move the mailing department to the Rembrandtstrasse. Please bring me 50 Velt letterhead sheets and envelopes when you come out. This time I wish you would come on Saturday, taking the 1:15 p.m. train from Vienna. Please bring along the morning mail from the Rembrandtstrasse. Have Kalinsky mail me what comes later. I would like you to spend the night here and remain until Sunday evening. Best regards, T.H.H. The typographical error appeared in the week column on page 3 of the 6th issue of Die Welt. Before me is the manuscript written in pencil in Herzl's characteristic hand, and there on the 3rd page, clear and legible, is the ill-fated word Angioch. Just who had been Angiochs or ridiculed, according to this account by Herzl? None other than his honor, the mayor of Vienna, Dr. Karl Luger. The anti-Semitic ringleader, Dr. Luger, had made a propaganda junket to the Austrian-Hungarian frontier in order to stir up the Christian population against their Jewish compatriots. In the city of Pressburg, he and his entourage had wandered by error into a street inhabited largely by Jews. There he was recognized and greeted with loud shouts of "Away with Luger!" and sundry other jibes. The police moved in at once, but did they take action against the itinerant agitator Dr. Luger? Not at all. They arrested several Jews for creating a disturbance. The word "ulk," joke, from which Angiocht is derived, is more common in Germany than in Austria, and may have been unfamiliar to the Viennese typesetter. Those of a psychoanalytical turn of mind may go further and attribute the error to a Freudian slip, for the typesetter was a social democrat, and the Viennese social democrats of those days were anything but kindly disposed toward Dr. Luger and his Christian Social Party. In any event, the typo had no repercussions. The official correction by Luger, which Herzl feared, failed to materialize. On Tuesday, July 6, the group of Zionist doctors headed by J. Shallot had returned to Vienna after tending wounded soldiers from the Greek-Turkish War in Turkish military hospitals. I met Shallot on the 9th and suggested that he also go to Reichenau. He did so 2 days later and reported to Herzl on the experiences of the Jewish medical expedition. That Sunday evening, after receiving some last instructions from Herzl preparatory to my departure for Vienna, I took my papers from the desk and remarked, Now that Shallot is back, of course, my term of office at Die Welt has expired." I said it as matter-of-factly as I could, as though referring to an accomplished fact which I had no intention of trying to change. I explained it was decided that I would fill in for Shallot while he was away. Now Herzl realized that I was speaking of resigning. His reply was short and to the point. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You're staying." When I was about to object, he repeated firmly, almost as though giving an order, "You're staying." Then, quickly changing the subject, he reviewed his instructions for the next issue of the magazine. Among the manuscripts which I brought to Reichenau to show Herzl was the one whose history may bear mentioning. A few days earlier, as I was making my usual inspection of the newspapers at the Café Central, my eye had been caught by a strange item in the Berliner Tageblatt. It was a solemn manifesto of the Rabbinical Association of Germany, signed by 5 rabbis of Berlin, Frankfurt, Breslau, Halberstadt, and Munich. The document opened as follows. The endeavors of so-called Zionists to found a Jewish national state in Palestine are contrary to the messianic promises of Judaism as contained in Holy Scripture and later religious sources. The concluding sentence was, religion and patriotism alike therefore impose upon us the duty of urging all those who have the welfare of Judaism at heart to shun the aforementioned Zionist endeavors, and in particular the Congress, which, despite all warnings, is still being planned. I read this declaration at the Café Central, was overcome by righteous indignation, and promptly wrote a furious article. I presented the rabbi's statement at the beginning, placed it, as it were, in the pillory, and then proceeded to analyze it, endowing the 5 authors with the title of the protest rabbis. Upon arriving in Reichenau, I submitted my article to Herzl. He read the rabbi's lament, then my wrathful commentary, and marked several passages in the margin as though to express agreement. When he nodded approvingly at the end, my last doubts were laid to rest. The article was accepted and would appear, and the honorable protest rabbis would get their comeuppance. But it was not to be. Herzl paid me compliments and praised my polemical talents, but the article was too sharp. I will myself assume the task of conveying our opinion to the 5 gentlemen, he said, and added smilingly, with your permission, I will borrow your word, protest rabbi, from the article for the general behoof. The result was that the issue number 7 of Die Welt, July 16, 1897, contained a lead article by Herzl entitled Protest Rabbis. It was, of course, far superior to mine in both literary style and moderation of tone. At the same time, it brilliantly settled accounts with the 5 protesters and deflated their accusations. The term protest rabbi became a permanent part of our Welt vocabulary and was used to categorize a certain type of anti-Zionist. It did considerable damage to its original targets and their supporters, for other rabbis were anxious to avoid being lumped together with the protest rabbis. I thus had the satisfaction, albeit anonymously, of seeing my coinage render good service to the cause. Issue number 7 of Die Welt, which contained Herzl's article, enjoyed a further distinction. It was confiscated by the public prosecutors. Is that prosecutor or it says prosecutor's office in Vienna? I don't know if there's a prosecutor there, but however, this minor calamity had nothing to do with the case of the 5 rabbis, as the next chapter will show. And since I'm under 30 minutes, barely, I will keep going. 20. Die Welt had aroused the public prosecutors, see, it is prosecutors, displeasure by accurately reporting an anti-Semitic outbreak which had occurred in the town of Tarnow in Galicia. The outrages which followed a tavern brawl were committed by soldiers of the 57 Infantry Regiment stationed in Tarnow. Die Welt quoted an account in the Polish language Krakow Daily Dziennik Krakowski as follows. Friday evening, the soldiers attacked citizen Weinfeld and injured him severely in the head. Saturday morning, they also injured several Jews. On Sunday, a veritable state of siege prevailed. All doors had to be barred. The soldiers marched through the streets with drawn bayonets, beating and stabbing any Jew who crossed their path. The police drove the people off the streets but did not interfere with the soldiers in their work. Despite the sending of a deputation to the district administrator and the military commandant, no security measures were taken. Many people have already been injured, including a 14-year-old girl. Police patrols marched past the rioting soldiers without disturbing them. I saw a corporal of the 57th Infantry Regiment wreck a poor Jew's shop while the police patrol cursed at the Jews for not going home. The public prosecutor's office found the whole affair most painful, not because anti Semitic rioting had occurred, there was nothing unusual in that, but because the rioters were soldiers of the Imperial Army whose duty was supposedly to preserve law and order and ensure the safety of all citizens. Not only that, but the local authorities, who should have put an end to the outrage, had stood by and done nothing. How should the matter be dealt with? Obviously, what had been done could not be undone. Hence, there was nothing left but to resort to an old and tested remedy. The paper that reported the embarrassing occurrences was what? The paper that reported the embarrassing occurrences was confiscated. No point in letting people at home and abroad know what had been happening up in Galicia. Herzl took the confiscation calmly. He was prepared for episodes of that sort, which in no way shook his determination to employ free expression of opinion on behalf of his oppressed co-religionists. Moreover, we enjoyed a stroke of good fortune. Official red tape delayed the confiscation until the day after the issue had been mailed out, with the result that all our regular subscribers received their copies. The usual confiscation ceremonies then proceeded. Uniformed policemen marched placidly from coffee house to coffee house and from news vendor to news vendor, collecting all copies of Die Welt. The cafe habitués generally took no notice whatever of this familiar ritual. One point should be made in connection with the events at Tarnow. However reprehensible, they were very different from the periodic pogroms suffered by the Jews in Tsarist Russia. The pogroms, as a rule, were officially, or at least semi-officially, inspired. They had a deliberate function, that of using the Jews as a lightning rod to draw off popular discontent, and they generally ended in large-scale bloodshed and other crimes. By comparison, the misdeeds of the soldiers at Tarnow were fairly mild. Jews were merely beaten and stabbed, not murdered, and the outbreak was wholly spontaneous, with no official provocation. In fact, the local military and civil authorities were undoubtedly given a stiff reprimand by Vienna afterward and warned to do their duty if another such incident ever occurred. It was not difficult for the rioting soldiers in Tarnow to identify the Jews among the town population, for their special dress, side curls, etc. made them readily recognizable. Indeed, I recall a story in this connection which has the double virtue of being historically true and of being available in Herzl's words. Thus, we read in an article by Herzl in issue number 6 of Die Welt. The Hungarian writer Agai tells in a feuilleton the following pretty story. Once he was in Ostend together with a Hungarian bishop who was wearing boots under his long coat. A long coat and boots, however, are the identifying marks by which the Ostend street urchins recognize Polish Jews. Hence, they ran along behind the bishop, taunting him and pelting him with stones, as they make a practice of doing to Polish Jews who come to Ostend. The clerical gentleman was utterly beside himself and looked for a policeman to protect him from the boys' inexplicably mischievous behavior. When he asked the policeman what was the matter with them, the officer smiled good naturedly. Oh, they act that way with Jews. What do you mean, Jew? I am a bishop, and he threw back his coat so that the astounded policeman could see the large golden cross. However, when the bishop, much agitated as a result of his adventure, rejoined his fellow countryman Agai and told him what had happened, the latter said, Now you see, your grace, what it is like to be a Jew. You tasted it for only a quarter of an hour. We have endured it for 1800 years. As we have already seen, Herzl took the confiscation of an issue of Die Welt with complete equanimity. However, the incident which precipitated it and the fate of the Tarnow Jews left him anything but unmoved. His mood, one of bitter resignation, was expressed in a brief commentary that appeared in the week column of Die Welt. An anti Semitic outrage in Tarnow. We record it like the others that come to us from all over the world. There will be many more like it. We record the doleful event without attempting to exaggerate it. It is no more significant than the others, and unfortunately, no more insignificant. This time, it was soldiers who committed outrages against the Jews. Things were exactly the same in the dark ages of history, which we cannot recall without anguish. A bit of the Middle Ages staggers raw and bloody through the streets of a modern city, and there is fear, the old fear that returns again and again. All that is really new is that the report appears in every paper in the world the following day and is forgotten the day after that. Perhaps that is how it must be. That is as far as public opinion goes in getting aroused about such things. It takes note of the occurrence just as it takes note of the new moon. The first snow or the first cockchafer. The Jews are obviously there, so that outrages can be committed against them from time to time. Perhaps that is their mission, for which so many are searching. And that's the end of chapter 20. There's Herzl.